All right, 7th graders. So this is the last thing that you guys need to do to finish up this assignment. And it's basically just listen to what I have to say. So when we started the introduction of this 5 weeks ago, we had these 2 learning targets. I can explain why elk in the Madison River Valley have a shortened lifespan compared to the elk in the Lamar Valley. And I can give cause as to the reduction of the Madison River Valley herd size. So basically what you guys learned in that introduction is you guys kind of learned a little bit about what the habitat in Lamar Valley looks like versus what the habitat in the Madison River Valley looks like. And then the big thing that you guys kind of learned in this in part 1 was that your Lamar Valley elk population was about 8,000 to 12,000 elk all year round, which is huge. And they lived anywhere from 16 years on average to, between 20 and 25 years. On the other hand, not too far from the Lamar Valley, we have the Madison River Valley, and we have an elk population there as well. But they're only living on average 10 years, with some living maybe to 16 years old. Okay, but their elk population is significantly smaller. It's only 500 to 800 as far as their population size. Then you guys were introduced to a couple pictures in part 1 where you guys saw how big and open the Lamar Valley was and how you kind of had a closed off little habitat here, much smaller. You got the Madison River and then some geothermal features which were huge as we learned in the Madison River Valley. Okay, you guys also read and you found out a little bit more about the difference in those habitats as well as the size of the habitats. So Lamar was a lot bigger versus Madison River was smaller. It had the river, it had the hot springs where we had, some of that snow all year round melting off due to the hot springs. So we always had grass to eat in that area. So it seems like it would be kind of a nice place for elk to live because they could eat grass all year long. Okay. So that's kind of where you guys left in part 1. Part 2, we learned about, just the fact that some of these elk were, and it's something you already knew, but that the elk were dying younger in the Madison River Valley. Okay. Part 3 was a huge slide. This is a big key component to this. We learned about the reintroduction of wolves into Yellowstone. So as you guys learned in that video in 1990, the early 1900s, they removed all the wolves from Yellowstone and they kept the wolves out of Yellowstone. But in 1995, they realized that, this is just not the normal habitat and this is a national park. We want it to be the exact same unfiltered habitat that it was 100 years ago. So they reintroduced 14 wolves, and then eventually as those wolves became accustomed to Yellowstone, they started reproducing and forming packs, and we saw how those wolf packs grew over the years. Okay, in part 4, you guys were introduced to this big piece of evidence. And, after part 3, you guys may have thought, well, maybe the elk for some reason are just getting eaten more in Madison River. And that's why they have such numbers, such lower numbers. But really, does that explain that they're dying young? Because just because they're getting eaten a lot more doesn't mean they're necessarily all dying young. Okay, so why are they still dying young? So this is where you learned in part 4 that the elk in the Madison River Valley have these deformed jaws. Okay, and because of these deformed jaws, they were starting to starve. So this really does explain why the elk in this area are dying younger, is they're just not getting enough food and dying. Okay, but that doesn't mean that they're not reproducing. Okay, elk who's 10 years old has probably had several calves in her lifetime. So yeah, it might to some small extent explain why their population size was a little small, but mainly knowing about their jaws, we learn that they're dying younger just from starvation mainly. Okay, they're just not getting the nutrition they need. And we learned that came from the geothermal areas. So we know that in that specific habitat, we had these hot springs that were very high in silicon dioxide, which is really very similar to eating sand or grass. And that because the elk were going there in the winter to eat because there was grass growing all year long, they were being exposed to higher levels of the silicon dioxide in their food, which was just degrading their jaws, breaking them down, and then causing them to, even though they had plenty of food, to just not get enough to eat because their jaws were no longer working correctly. Okay, so we learned that in part 5, and then finally in part 6, you guys kind of talked a little bit more about wolves. So we revisited this concept of wolves, okay? Up until this point, we've really explained, yeah, this is why, you know, it's this jaw malformation. That is the main reason the lifespan for the Madison River elk is so much younger than the Lamar Valley elk, is they're just starving. But there's still more to it than that. So when we look back at the fact that we have a different predator in their system now, okay, I mean, think about it. If you were a predator and you were chasing a herd of elk, are you guys going to go for the biggest, strongest elk? Or are you guys going to go for the smaller, weaker ones that are lagging behind? Okay, and now take into consideration that a lot of this population is smaller and weak due to this malnourishment because of their malformation in their jaws, okay? So a lot of the population was just to a point where they were weaker and they couldn't get away as well. And then they also lived in this crazy Madison River Valley that had deep snow, you know, and if the wolves were able to move them away from the river where there wasn't a lot of snow, then the elk oftentimes just didn't have the strength to get away from them in their crazy habitat with mountains on each side of them. And again, deep, deep snow. So it was really easy. So, I mean, yes, the Lamar Valley, they have wolves coming after them. Yes, they have to struggle more getting their food. But on the other hand, they don't have to worry about malformed jaws. They're not weak due to starvation. They have a wider area to get away from wolves that are, you know, present in their ecosystem as well. But because the elk in the Madison River were a lot weaker, and they just have a harder habitat to live in, that really ties everything together and explains not only why they are dying younger, but why their population size is so small. Okay, so really that concludes your guys' case study, and hopefully you guys, you know, followed along and were able to kind of put everything together prior to this video. But if not, I hope you guys learned something from this, and I hope you all are having a wonderful day. You can now turn in the assignment. You are done. I'll talk to you soon.